Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here tonight for our stimulating presentation that we have for you. I'm Gregg Kimball. I'm the Director of Public Services and Outreach at the Library of Virginia, and I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker, Rohulamin Quander. He is a native Washingtonian, retired senior administrative law judge for the District of Columbia. He holds the BA and JD degree from Howard University. Member of the Quander family, who we'll be hearing about tonight. Amazing story, both in the colonies of Virginia and in Maryland from the 1670s. In 1985, Judge Quander established the Quander Historical and Educational Society, a 501(c)(3) entity created to document, preserve, and share the historical legacy of the Quander family. He's the author of 4 books, the latest of which is The Quanders, since 1684, An Enduring African-American Legacy. I got a chance to read this book. It's a really, really fine family history that weaves together some really remarkable stories that you'll hear from Mr. Quander about. And I think one of the key points he makes in his book that's really important is it's not only an African-American story, but a quintessentially American story written from an African-American perspective. He's done all kinds of other work, including human and civil rights work related to the Dalit or the untouchable population of India. He is also the author of Nellie Quander, Alpha Kappa Alpha Pearl, the biography of AKA's first national president. So without further ado, Judge Quander.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here. I want to thank you very much. I am Rohulamin Quander. We're going to have a few minutes of hopefully good fun and good education at the same time. First and foremost, the Quander family history and its related stories is not just a history of a Black family or Black American history, but rather it is the history it is American history told from an African-American perspective. The Quander family is one of the oldest documented African-American families in the United States, first noted in Maryland and Virginia in the 1670s. Now, the documented history of the Quander family dates from a last will and testament of 1684 from a colonial legislator and immigrant named Henry Adams, who was residing in Charles County, Maryland. And he was an immigrant in 1639 from Britain, from England. And under his will that he wrote, he provided for the eventual freedom of 2 of his 4 enslaved, Henry Quando and a woman named Margaret Pugh, who would later become Henry's wife. They had at least 4 children, Henry II, Mary, Victoria, and Elizabeth, and made an everyday life for themselves in Charles County. There you can't read the will, but that's the document. It's kind of faded, if you would be too, if you were that old, but it provides in his disposition in the corner on the right, you see there, if you can't read it, but it's the language that is providing for the freedom of Henry and Margaret. Now, free and in Southern Maryland in 1695, there it is, Ignatius Wheeler, also of Charles County, a landowner, pardon me, deeded a portion of land called Wheeler's Folly to Henry Quando on a 99-year lease. Margaret wasn't mentioned. Women were not emancipated at the time, and she was not mentioned at that particular time. And the land came initially from King Charles of England in about 1632 to the Lords of Baltimore, and then to the Wheeler family. And a portion of that was subdivided to the Quandos in 1695, and it was called Wheeler's Folly. Now, the family name Quander, the varied spelling of the Quander family name, you see Quander today, but through the decades and millennium, we have Amquando, Amaquando, Amunquando, etc. down at the bottom where I am Quando. Interesting story about this. When I was a student at Howard University, about 17 years of age, I was an international pal. And they are the other students who welcome the foreign students and try to make them a little at home and acclimate them to the United States and Washington, D.C. in particular. And as I met a number of students from West Africa and Ghana in particular, they were calling me Mr. Quando. And I didn't think anything of it, didn't say anything about it. And after it happened a number of times, I called myself correcting somebody and say, well, no, it's Quander. And he said, well, you must not know the real origin of your family. I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, that's a Fanti name. We know that name. And he was from Ghana. I can't say where exactly. And he was explaining to me that the Akan language of KW and the QU language of the Anglo was pronounced exactly the same. And that in Ghana, it had a silent end on it, DOH. And I asked some of the older family members if they knew anything about that. They didn't know anything about those details, but I was told that back there somewhere, but nobody knew exactly when back there somewhere was. The name used to be Quando. Apparently it got changed to ER. Who did that? Well, the records, possibly a census taker, because the census of 1800 carries that in there. So we think that's where it happened. So you see how we migrated from Quander of present to Quando of origin here in this country. And as I relate the story today, I will be going chronologically, but I'll be crossing back and forth across the Potomac River to Maryland to Virginia and Virginia to Maryland, because Quanders were in significant present on both sides. I do my best not to confuse you, but it may prove a little bit daunting at times. Now, in 1741, Henry Quando won a case in Charles County, Maryland, for a debt that was owed to him. The jury foreman was a man named John Hanson, later who became the first president of the United States of America under the Articles of Confederation, 8 years before George Washington. Quando's success in that case, where he stood up for the debt that was owed and got a judgment from the jury, underscored our entrepreneurial spirit, our focus, our determination, our internal strength, and it served as an inspiration for those of us who would come in later generations. As well, we also learned that we were intersecting with people who had very important places in history, of which John Hanson, who was the foreman of the jury in 1741, would be the president of the United States, the first president in 1781. Now, over time, George Washington's attitude toward enslavement changed. You're looking there at the cover of his last will and testament. Now, it appears that he was largely influenced by the bravery and the focus of Black men who had enslaved and freed, who had fought in the American Revolutionary War. Later, his will provided for the manumission of his enslaved, but postponed their ability to leave Mount Vernon not until Martha Washington died. Now, although she lived until May 1802, she elected to release them effective January 1st, 1801. Notice I didn't say free. Now, there's a backstory. Let's go back a step onto slave back 1 year. There's a backstory that goes with that, because the enslaved knew that they were destined to be free from 1799 when they found out about the will. And the record reflects that Martha was deeply afraid that somebody was going to help usher her out. She was afraid that she might wake up dead one morning. So she elected on the anniversary of George Washington's death to announce that she would free everyone effective January 1st, 1801, for those who had been freed, and for those who were under the Custis dower, she could not free them. So she would release them. Have to understand that clarification. So they were released, and that group went back to the Custis family, and some of them stayed enslaved until Emancipation Proclamation and effectiveness of the freedom of the slaves, which in some cases didn't get away until after the end of the war. Among those who were released was Nancy Carter, who shortly thereafter married Charles Quander, a free Black man who was in the Mount Vernon area on the Potomac side of the river. And here you see the image of me as a licensed certified tour guide here in the District of Columbia at Mount Vernon, addressing a group of people, and a holograph of Nancy Carter Quander. Needless to say, we don't know what she looked like, but she is there represented in an exhibit in Mount Vernon, which I will come back to in a minute. One early connection, though, was through an enslaved man named West Ford. Many of you Virginians know of West Ford, born of a slave named Venus and a so-called unknown father. And of course, the belief is in many circles, not absolutely proven, that the so-called unknown father is really Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew, who inherited Mount Vernon upon George Washington's death. So while it is not absolutely proven, it's pretty well accepted, I'll put it that way, that Bushrod Washington was West Ford's father, and West Ford is himself the ancestor of all of the Quanders who are from the Mount Vernon section of the Quander family. And that is also a question that gets asked often, that's also the lineal and sanguine connection of the Quander family to George Washington through apparently through his nephew, Bushrod Washington. Now, back to the Maryland side, in 1830, there was a landmark case called Quando, still using the original Quando v. Claggett. What happened there, this Miss Claggett died about 1822, 23, and in her will, she said it was her will that her man, in some places call it Henry, and other places call it Harry, Quando, should work for a year, and that at the end of the year, that half of the proceeds would go to him and the other half would go to someone else. Well, it didn't have the word free. And he waited for years and years and years. And after there was no apparent action to give him his freedom, he was able to initiate a court case. And the man who we all know, Francis Scott Key, was his attorney. So Francis Scott Key, when he wasn't busy writing things like "Oh, Say Can You See" by the Dawn's Early Light, he was engaged in an active practice in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, working to assist those who were seeking their freedom to get it. Not that he was a great liberator in that context, he still believed in the unequalness of the races. But he always loved money because his record shows that he took a number of very important cases for which he was roundly and very handsomely compensated. Whether he got anything from this particular case money-wise, I'm not exactly sure. But Francis Scott Key was a family attorney. Let's go back to Virginia for a few minutes. Around the same time that this happened, we had something called the Registration of Free Negroes. There were a series of registration books in which the Black people who did get their freedom had to register themselves, re-register themselves, and re-register themselves again every few years to state that they were still in that area. And each time, even though it was demeaning to think that people had to go and register themselves like you would cattle, with the cattle mark and registering your brand, in retrospect now, it is of some interest and historic benefit because it told us not only their names, it listed sometimes what areas, not an address, but what areas they lived in, who they were the son of, the daughter of, the mother of, the sister of, who freed them, etc. So it has given us some indication in this registration book of what these people were doing, who they were, etc. Whether they were tall or short, light, dark, brown, fat, skinny, however you might want to identify it. If they had a missing finger because of an industrial accident, it would say so. And among those who were listed in that was Nancy Carter Quander, the same person who was one of the individuals listed in this registration. The particular one I'm talking about is dated 1831, but it's in this particular book. And on November 14th, 1835, there was an article in the Alexandria Gazette reflecting Nancy Quander as among those who were tending to George Washington's grave. The record of that indicates that although there are no written records of who is buried in George Washington's slave cemetery for his enslaved, except for Frank Lee, who was one of his personal and manservants. In our family history and oral law, we have it that Nancy died and was buried there somewhere in about 1853. Now, the Quander family's presence and contributions has given rise to 4 streets named Quander in the Washington, D.C. area. First was Quander Alley, from about 1890s, now renamed Quanders Street, located in Southeast Washington, D.C., adjacent to the National Baseball Stadium. This is also the site of the Battle of Washington during the War of 1812. You see me squeezing, holding on to my lamppost and my sign. You're not going to take my Quanders Street away from me again. And I petitioned the District of Columbia when they were redeveloping that area to restore Quanders Street at its present original location. And as you see, it has been. So if you're coming out of the baseball park and you're going to walk to the metro, if you go walk to the station on entrance on the right, you will have to walk past Quanders Street. If you walk to the left, well, you'll be cheated. You won't be able to see it. Okay. Now, in addition to this Quanders Street, we have in Fairfax County, the site of Charles Quander's Dairy Farm. Next line. We have another Quanders Street, except there it is. It's called Quander Road. Those of you right there in Virginia, especially Fairfax County, or those who may come up and down Route 1, you've seen Quander Road. That land, that 88-acre dairy farm that's right there. This man sitting here on your left is Charles Henry Quander, 1843, 1919. He was the owner of that property. And that buckboard wagon, you see, he's sitting there and you don't see the street, but that's Quander Road right there. And on the right, my wife is a professional artist. So the book I'll talk about in a little bit, we had two pictures and that's the other one. We had him standing up next to his wagon. That's his wife. I'm sorry, she's looking away, but that's what she was doing. So that is Quander Road in Fairfax County. Now, those of you who are listening and you're down, and if you happen to be in Prince William County, there's Quander Street. And then in Bowie, Maryland, and in Prince George's County, we have Quander's Promise. Now, I know a large part of my audience is further south in Richmond, but I also know there are a number of people in the audience who perhaps are in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area. So you see, we do have quite a few of Quander Streets, Quander Roads, etc. Now, in 1926, the Quander family held its first annual Quander family reunion. It was held in Woodlawn, Virginia, adjacent to property formerly owned by President George Washington. Here you're looking at 4 of the founders of the 1926 reunion, and they were gathered there at the 1938 reunion, and there we have a picture of them. This man that you see is Tom Quander. Tom Quander was, for many decades, an employee of Mount Vernon, as were a number of other Quander family members. And he was a gardener landscaper. Much of the maintenance and creation of the gardening and landscaping was done by a complete crew, of which he was one and worked there for many, many years. And when they were a little shorthanded, he also served as a tomb guard, guarding President Washington, although the employment records did not carry him as a tomb guard. He's employed as a landscaper gardener. Now, the Quander family reunion, the 2010, the 85th reunion, was held at Mount Vernon at the invitation of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Now, we had about 225, 250 people there, but my immediate family and I snuck away to take a little picture at this particular site. There you see me with the green hat. That's my beautiful wife in front of me. My granddaughter there, my daughter there in the fuchsia on the left, my son there in the shorts. And we're standing there, and that is a reproduction of one of the slave cabins that, based on a photograph that they had, they built that anew, and I dedicated that in 2007. So we went there so we could take a picture of that enslaved cabin as a replica so that people could get a sense of what those particular facilities looked like. So there we are there. As far as we know, we are the only family other than the Syphax family who were also enslaved at Mount Vernon, who have had a family reunion there at the invitation of Mount Vernon Ladies Association. I guess they would be open to others if they petitioned and requested the opportunity to do so. Perhaps they will. Now, in October 2016, Mount Vernon opened an exhibit that was quite different. It's called Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And it was a little different from most exhibits on slavery. Most of them had focused on the enslaver and the master. This particular one was focused on the enslaved and dedicated to their memory. Now, when George Washington died, there were 317 enslaved men, women, and children there, of which 123 were his, quote, own, as if you could own people, which we know you cannot. And then Martha had more than he did, and then there were some who were rented. So when the exhibit opened, they picked out 19 enslaved of the enslaved to represent the group, and they presented those particular enslaved during the exhibit. And the exhibit was there, intended to be there for 2 years, opened in October 2016. It ended up being there just short of 5 years. It just came down recently. So that exhibit was there for quite a while. Now, Nancy Carter Quander, who you just saw earlier, we're back to her. She was one of those people who was featured, one of the 19. She was a spinner, which means a cloth maker. She and her mother, Suki Bay, her sister Rose, and other family members, they were at River Farm. River Farm, or Mount Vernon, you might know, is 5 different plantations under the generic name Mount Vernon. And River Farm was the next one up along the Potomac River, where they were in residence. And where they spent the bulk of their enslaved lives. Now that exhibit came down, but the exhibit also featured Gladys Quander Tansel. Gladys Quander Tansel, who was, next slide, there she is, was the first African-American interpreter guide there at Mount Vernon. She was there for 35 years. And there she is, a picture of her conducting one of her tours. She is the first one who in 1995 was given the responsibility of conducting the slave tours. She did not write the narrative, but she conducted it, and she was well known, well respected, and very knowledgeable, and was frequently asked questions. And perhaps one of the main questions she was asked was George Washington a good slave owner? And Gladys would look at that person, and she would have what we refer to as a pregnant pause. And then she would say, well, young man or lady or sir, the word good and slave owner do not belong in the same sentence, perhaps not even in the same paragraph. But she wouldn't be disrespectful, but she was very stern, and she didn't mince words, but she would make it very clear, and she would end up whatever she had to say. Well, I guess you could say that President Washington was better than some and worse than others. But she never really said he was a, quote, good slave owner or dealer. Now, I continue to have an affiliation, but let's go back a second. I want to add something. I continue to have an affiliation with George Washington's Mount Vernon from time to time. I continue to be an advisor. And I want to let you know today, I'm telling you today that on next Tuesday, when we observe George Washington's 190th birthday, they will have an event which you'll be able to find online if you put it in the internet. It's called 2/22/22, recognizing February 22nd, 2022, the observance and celebration of George Washington's birthday. It will be an event that will be aired. You'll be able to track it down, and it will be airing through the internet, and you will be able to find it. I am in there representing the enslaved community, and I'll be talking about how Washington got to be where it is and how Washington, D.C. got its name. So look for it on the 22nd, 2/22/22. Go to Mount Vernon, go on their website. I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Here you see us at the 2018 Black History Month event, observing and recognizing African-American contributions in World Wars, but particularly this was World War I. This exhibit was called We Returned Fighting, recognizing the fact that African-American men and some women have participated in meaningful ways in contributions in defense of our nation. And here we are, a number of us were there gathered for recognition of some of the Quander men. No women were in this exhibit, but women participated in World War I. But Quander men who were recognized as World War I veterans by Prince George's County, Maryland. Now, the Maryland, Washington, D.C. Quanders, while not formally calling their periodic reunions family reunion, have been having meetings of that family nature since about the 1880s. You're looking at a family homestead built in 1875 by my great-great-grandfather, Gabriel Quander, at this homestead in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. In 1984, the Quanders celebrated our 300th documented year at Howard University, tricentennial, 1684-1984, 300 documented years. And as I mentioned, because we found another, I referenced in the beginning, documented in the 1670s. So we are really now on the eve of our 350th year. Now, with reference to the house I just showed you, let's stay on this slide, but with reference to the house I just showed you, that is where many of the activities of the Maryland Quanders in planning took place. We established beneficial societies, and these were societies because they didn't have Social Security, Blacks didn't have insurance. Men came together, men and women came together to bury the dead, to provide for the widows, to feed the hungry, to do whatever things we needed to do on behalf of each other. So we formed beneficial societies, and some of those were formed right there in that house. And of course, that is how we got to be from where we were to where we are at this particular point. Now, when we had this exhibit, you see that handsome guy standing in the middle with a full head of hair. Well, I am he. I don't know what happened to the hair, gone with the wind, but it's just a memory. But anyway, I'm still here, what's left, okay. But that particular reunion, if any of you remember or aware of it, recognized nationally, internationally. We had a proclamation of recognition from President Reagan. It was entered into the United States Congressional Record. Governor Hughes from Maryland sent a proclamation. Then Governor Robb from Virginia sent a proclamation. It was featured on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, Radio France International, BBC, Ebony, the Afro, the Jet magazine. We had reporters in various languages, German, Swedish, etc. So it was quite a grand event that we had this particular event. And as a result, I established the Quander Historical and Educational Society, a 501c3 organization established to identify, preserve, document, protect, and share the written legacy of the Quander family. And this evening, this is part of the sharing. Earlier today, I spoke to 900 students. It was virtual at Walt Whitman Middle School. What 900 students were on the call, the entire school. So it is an educational process. People are interested at all different ages, and these were middle schoolers. And I thought maybe they would get bored, but I was told they didn't. They kept coming back more and more and more questions. Bells were ringing, time to change class, but they wanted to stay. So I guess I didn't put them to sleep, or maybe I didn't. They were too polite to tell me. Well, anyway, as a result of establishing the Quander Historic and Educational Society, we are on that same mission. And in 1985, the Quander family was featured for the first time. We've been in it 3 times. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History had an exhibit called After the Revolution, Everyday Life in America, 1780 to 1800. We didn't know how long we were going to be there, but the exhibit was there, and we were there from 1985 to 2002, 17 years. And you see that particular icon or photo on the left. That lady was Sadie Chin, C-H-I-N-N Quander, from Fairfax County, Virginia, and on Quander Road. Sadie Chin Quander, part of the Chin family as well. You see the medical shingle of Dr. John Thomas Quander, Howard University School of Medicine, class of 1909. You see an oval photo, a picture of Frederick Douglass, led to us by the Douglass family for the exhibit. And that typewriter there is very famous. That is the typewriter that Buck Franklin used. He was an attorney and a journalist. He used that typewriter to type up the ongoing daily reports of the burning down of Black Wall Street in 1921. He is the one who was the reporter who sent his daily updates on what was going on to the Black press and some of the white press, capturing what was going on And much of last year, where we had the documentary of the burning down of Black Wall Street, was based in part upon his reporting of what was going on. Buck Franklin was the father of historian John Hope Franklin, and the grandfather, John W. Franklin, who is currently a very significant member of the staff of the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. So that was the first of our 3 times in the Smithsonian. Now, as a follow-up to the tricentennial, a trip to Ghana, West Africa to meet with the Quander family was important. And maybe I should say as a prequel to the tricentennial, because they established contact with us. We established significant contact with them in 1983. I received over 200 communications, and some of them came forward over here to see us. And afterwards, some of us went over there to see them. And here you see a picture of me visiting with some of the Quander family members. That house, go back to the picture again, that house is as contemporary as any that we would find today in the Caribbean here or in southern part of the United States. And these are all members of the Quander family. The 2 people seated on your left, the lady seated on the far left is Agnes Quander, and that's her husband, Kofi Segopine. They were just here visiting us here in the United States for several months, and they just went back to Ghana fairly recently. Next slide. And here I am in one of the ancestral villages at the village of Kankaboom. And we visited a number of the villages, and we couldn't visit all of them. And most of these people, if not all of them, are somewhere connected in with the Quander family. And it was my pleasure and honor, and humble pleasure and honor, to go and be with actually the descendants. We are all the descendants of common ancestors, although the exact lineage is yet to be established. Now, as I conclude, I would like to say that I have published 4 books, the most recent of which, published last year in 2021, is The History of the Quander Family, the Quanders since 1684, an enduring African-American legacy. I'll come back to that in a few moments. My first book, which is not pictured here, was Quander Quality, the true story of a Black trailblazing diabetic, the biography of my father, James W. Quander. My father was a juvenile diabetic, possibly born with it in 1918, and he had several serious attacks of breakdowns, and the doctor said he probably would not live to be 10 years of age. Well, fortunately, he was rescued by insulin, and he always said that diabetes is not a death sentence, but a challenge to live. And I like to add, he faced the challenge and he was triumphant. So indeed, that was the first book, and it's available if you're interested. The second book, Nellie Quander, Alpha Kappa Alpha Pearl, the story of the woman who saved an international organization. Nellie Quander was the first national president of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. She was born in Washington, D.C. in 1880 and graduated from the M Street School, which is now called Dunbar High School, and Minor Normal, which is now part of the University of District of Columbia. She taught for 10 years, and then she went to Howard University and got a degree. She had a teaching certificate before, and in Pleasure Sorority in 1910, became its president in 1911, graduated in 1912, and she is the one who worked to keep the organization together when in 1912, another organization came forward, or women came forward inside of their AKA and decided to break away and form another organization. So Nellie stayed on and in the presidency and leadership, and did the job of making sure that it survived. Madam Vice President Kamala Harris is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, and they both became members of the sorority in the same chapter at Howard University, obviously at different times. So indeed, that was Nellie Quander, and she was quite an inspiration. She worked with Carter G. Woodson in Black History Month in literature. Her sister was the secretary of the association for many years. So they had a stellar history, and they are still feeling the positive effects of that stellar history. I am a member of, next slide, of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And I don't have the slide here, but stay right with this. I wrote my 50-year memoir, 50 plus Omega inspired years, tracing an Omega legacy to 1931 through my father and my uncle. Now, this picture you see, Quanders have been very involved over the centuries in religious institutions. We've come this far by faith is a chapter in the book. This church you're looking at here is St. Mary's of the Assumption Catholic Church in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. This is the quote new sanctuary. New, incidentally, is 1898, so I guess it's not new anymore. But this angle of this picture is very significant because the door you see on the right was the colored entrance. Because of racial segregation, the blacks had to go in that door and sit in the back and had to be separate from the whites. So when church was out, people were standing and talking. You see the whites in the center at the steps and the blacks off to the side. In the window between them, I had mentioned the beneficial societies that were founded. That is the beneficial window that was put there. So that room, that door today is not used. It is now a storage room and everybody can go in the main entrance, but that is the church in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. The Quanders in Virginia have a strong history in the Baptist church and to some extent in the Methodist church. This picture you see is Alfred Street Baptist Church, located on Alfred Street in Old Town Alexandria. This is the Quander legacy of association, I'm told, goes back to the year 1813. Now, this obviously is not an 1813 relic, but to your left, not pictured, is the sanctuary that preceded this. It's the 1855 sanctuary that served as a railroad station on the Underground Railroad and during the Civil War as a Civil War hospital. It is on the National Register of Historic Places, and that is to your left. Now, we have a sustained presence in military service as well. And you see a picture here. We were at Robert E. Lee Park in Fairfax County at a family reunion some years ago. And I created an exhibit called Quanders in Military Service because we have a very strong presence in military service. At the very top there with the hat on, the gentleman you see there is Corporal John Pearson Quander. We're going to see him in a minute. The lady at the bottom left, again, that's Nellie Quander. Well, why is she there? Well, one, she's his daughter, but that's not a good enough reason to be there, although she was a great daughter, I'm sure. But understand in World War and all of our wars, women have played a very, very significant role. So when World War I came, Nellie Quander at the bottom there, who was a school teacher in the DC public schools, was pulled out of the DC public schools and sent on a special assignment. She was sent to Detroit by Alice Dunbar Nelson, who was Paul Laurence Dunbar's widow. And Nellie Quander was sent to Detroit to evaluate and monitor and report back on the working conditions of colored women and girls working in their job sites, their payment, working conditions, and their housing. So she was selected and instructed and went up there during World War I to monitor that and report back. So that is the reason why she is there, because although she was a civilian, her work was particularly important for the benefit of colored women and young ladies. This is a closer slide of the same John Pearson Quander. He was a corporal in the Civil War, born in 1845. He served and enlisted on his 18th birthday in 1843, served with distinction, was the guide on, carried the flag. Flag is still in the family. And he, when the Grand Army came here in 1915, he was selected to deliver a keynote address on behalf of the colored troops. Don't know for sure, but we believe this photo is a formal photo was taken of him during that time frame when he was delivering that particular speech. Now, we also have in the family a number of Tuskegee Airmen. We have 3 in my immediate family because one on my mother's side, but we have 2 on the Quander side. Here you see Charles Johnson Quander Jr. standing there with his arm on the shoulder of one of his compatriots. Those 4 are Tuskegee Airmen, and they're standing in front of their B-25 bomber. And he was in service to our nation. And if you know of the historic legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, and he lived quite a long life. He just passed away about 10 years ago, Charles Johnson Quander. Now, this picture you see now, we are the only African-American family, and we may even be the only American family, I'm not going to say that though, that have 4 generals. Here you see these 4 generals right here. The man on the right with the red kerchief in his pocket is General Leo Brooks Jr. He was also the commandant of West Point, which is the #2 man in charge of all the cadets. He is the second African-American to serve as commandant of West Point, and he served in that capacity from 2002 to 2004. Now, the gentleman on his right with the lighter blue pants, that's General Mark Quander. He is the third and current commandant. He went in May of 2021 as the commandant in charge of all of the troops at West Point. The real handsome guy in the middle, the real tall one, that's yours truly. The next one, the 4-star general there, the tallest one of the group, that is General Vincent Keith Brooks. We are at his retirement service. 4-star general retiring. He was in charge and command of the entire Southeast Asian Command. That's General Vincent Keith Brooks. And during the Kuwait, Iran incursion, you were getting the daily report from then Colonel Vincent Keith Brooks. And then the one on the left, the older gentleman, is their father. That's General Leo Brooks Sr. The family is very honored to have 4 generals, and we thank God for the fact that we have been able to contribute to the protection of democracy and make a meaningful contribution as people of color in our nation as we go. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you all for listening with me today, tuning in. If you're interested, you can obtain a copy of my latest book, The Quanders, since 1684, An Enduring African-American Legacy. Now, you can get this on Amazon. You can get this at Barnes & Noble, but you can't get me there, because if you want it to be personally autographed by me, you have to go to the website, www.quanderquality.com, or you can also find me at info@quanderquality.com. The price is the same, but if you get it from me, you get a little treat. If you get it from them, I appreciate your support, but you will not be able to, it won't be signed. This gentleman, as you see, my wife is a professional artist, and looking over my shoulder, you see the original painting right there that this is the book cover of. I thank you very much, and if we have time for questions, I would be delighted to entertain them. Thank you indeed. It's been my honor.
Thank you so much, Judge Quander. That was a great presentation. And I know it was because I'm getting all kinds of really great questions from our audience tonight, which is a good, large audience, very lively.
Yes, yes. I'm delighted too.
We did put that link also in the chat if you'd like to get a copy of Judge Quander's book. I am going to ask you a quick question, and then we'll get to our audience questions, and we have quite a few of them actually. But one thing that we get asked a lot here at the Library of Virginia is, how does one go about putting together a family history like this? I know you spent a lot of time in archives, digging out all this information. Could you say a little bit about that?
There's several key points to focus on. The first one is talk to the family. If you're talking about a particular part of your family, you need to talk to whoever the oldest and older people in the family are. Depending upon your own age group, you might be the oldest one. But talk to mother, talk to father, talk to siblings, talk to aunt, talk to cousins. If there's somebody who's like family who lived next door down the street you know about, talk to them. So after you talk to them, you want to find out things such as, where did their family grow up? If you don't know where they grew up, or if they grew up on a certain street or a certain part of town, you can find that out. Do they belong to a church community? What church? Because depending upon the church, and you'll be able to find archives. Did they go to a university? What university? Where were they educated? This is all done to initiate the whole thing. I always tell people that a notepad is good, but a tape recorder is better. Reason for the tape recorder is because once you start talking, you can follow up with a reverse question, a sub question, a nuance, a clarification. You can't get that with a notepad. You can go back and listen to the tape recorder and take your notes of what you think is more important. Once you got that, then you can go to the census records, and depending upon the circumstance, you can go to the state archives, the county archives, etc. As I started talking to older members, and now, of course, I'm one of the older members because I started this when I was in law school. By that time, I was older than the 17 is when I went to Howard, but I was in law school, but still at Howard. I use some of my skills to look at archival records. And a significant amount of that time was spent in the Fairfax County Courthouse archives, which is different from the regular courthouse, but the archives and other archival sources in Fairfax County and in other places in Virginia, of course, in Richmond too, and in Maryland, the records down in the archives in Annapolis, and talking to people. And this has been a journey that started for me in 1968. But now the stories that have emerged, a lot of court cases which are not talked about today, tax records, a lot of stumbling blocks. But you can be encouraged by seeing how those stumbling blocks, if you kept going, can become stepping stones, because you get one piece here and another piece someplace else and a third piece, and you can maybe tie those together. So as I tell people, you can build those stumbling blocks into stepping stones. And as I told my students today, if you keep at it, your stepping stones can become pyramids. Same can be said about lemon. Lemon is bitter, but lemon and a little sugar, you can make lemonade. So the key is to keep going. And there are organizations you can join: African American Historical and Genealogical Society, just one. Then it's DNA testing. When I started, we didn't have such thing. 23andMe and many different DNA groups. I'm not talking in favor, I don't own stock in any of them, but they all have some good benefit and will be of benefit to you. This is how you get started. And then as you join and talk to other people, this never ends, because you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. You can, this is a life's work if you make it, but there's always something to be found. I didn't talk about it today, but on my father's mother's side from South Carolina, they were, through slavery, but we have a strong presence in the Fraser family. And we found out that we are very high on eligibility to become sons and daughters of the DAR and SAR. I haven't pursued it, don't intend to at this age, but they were very, very important in the American Revolutionary War. And we found out several people that we are tied to and related to. I'm not going to go into names, but it was very interesting. So there is a lot to find out.
Great. We had a couple questions that did relate to DNA, actually. One of our audience members asked if you had found any DNA connections with some of the Quando family in Ghana, and kind of connected to that, someone asked, are all Quanders related? I have a distant Quander DNA match.
Okay, the answer as far as Ghana is concerned, West Africa, no, we do not have any direct connection with them. Basically, they are not at that point yet. There may be a few. However, when we talked about Ghana, several of us said, well, you know what? We believe it's Ghana. We're told it is. Let's take a DNA test to see if it comes up that way. I said, gee, that would be something. We've been going on this assuming that. So I took my own, and others did too. And although it turned up that Nigeria was predominant over Ghana, Ghana was there. So I was satisfied. It was one of those whew, moments. So yes, but not directly with them.
Very good. We also had an interesting question. You mentioned, of course, Bushrod Washington. And someone asked whether he was the president of the American Colonization Society, and whether any of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon were sent to Liberia.
Well, I mean, I'd answer it this way, a couple of components. First of all, there's a leftover. As far as we know, all Quanders are related, but sometimes we don't know how we are all related. So I'll answer that question that way to the person who asked. There are 4 main branches, but we're all the same from the Maryland side of the river. Okay. Now, as far as Bushrod Washington was concerned, he was a member of a number of those types of societies. He was a very early member of the Supreme Court, and he inherited Mount Vernon from his uncle George Washington. But exactly what role he had in the colonization group, I'm not knowledgeable enough to answer that with any details. Yeah.
Yeah, the other part of the question is whether any of the enslaved people, to your knowledge, that were at Mount Vernon ever were sent to Liberia in the American colonization movement.
Okay, the answer is I do not know. We have not heard knowingly of any of our Quander components leaving and going to Liberia. However, there is some indication that some did go to Nova Scotia. Yes, went north. Those would have been free after Nancy Carter Quander and others went up there, because there's some indication they may have gone to Nova Scotia, and also some indication it came back.
Very good. One other question we had was about the early Quanders family. And there's something, again, we get a lot here at the library. Were any of them indentured servants? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, the difference between an indentured servant and someone who is enslaved.
Okay, well, the difference is the indentured servant were people who came over here. They came voluntarily, and in some cases they came involuntarily, but they signed a contract that said they would be tied to the land for a certain period of years. They'd be working off their passage, working off their debt. They were typically white Europeans. I talked about Henry Adams, the colonial legislator who came in 1639. He had a 7-year indentured obligation. He came in 1639. He worked his 7 years. And then at the end of his 7 years, for reasons unknown to me, he didn't get his freedom, indentured freedom to become a white man, to be free and do whatever he wanted to do. And he had to go to court. He successfully won, I don't know, the court case after he'd gone to court, and then he became a free white British man in the colonies. That did not apply to the enslaved. The blacks who were brought here initially were of an indeterminate nature. They came here in 1619. Permanent slavery, as we know it to become, had not yet formulated. We're not exactly sure when the first Quandos came here. We think it was in the 1660s, but we don't have a document yet to prove it. But by the 1660s, the permanency of the institution was still in process of being formed. But Henry Adams elected to release 2 of his 4 enslaved Africans by name, Henry Quando, who gave his own first name. We have another name, Edum Quando, as a suspected ancestor. Not sure that he was, but we have that name. So Henry Adams gave his enslaved young man his own name, but one of them, as Henry, the white man, came indentured, and the one black got his freedom under will. That's the difference.
Excellent. Let's see, I'm going to check here and see if there's a few other questions that we have from the audience. One person has asked, obviously you have this remarkable history of your family, but what did they face in terms of pushback from white citizens as the family was trying to make its way through a period when, of course, most African Americans were enslaved?
Well, the answer is they had pushback at every step. Henry and Margaret got their freedom in 1686 under the 1684 will. They didn't have children, they at least not recorded, and then they did get children. And then very early, around 1702, Margaret was subject to a tax on black females. They went to court and said, no, that tax was only intended for the slave enslavers to give revenue to the king, because we didn't have states yet. We had colonies, and it didn't apply to black women. Well, the court ruled otherwise, so they had to pay that. So that was a tax against them. And then as they kept going up, every year they were running into tax issues. And then when well, I'm not going to go into all of them, but when Henry passed away around 1714 or so, Margaret was by then a widow, and she was running into tax problems. And eventually she was able to get out from under it, but they were pushing it every way that they went. And all through the 1700s, there was some type of adversity. Now the girls, the young ladies, were having children. Unfortunately, all 2 of them for sure had children out of wedlock, and they didn't say there was a marriage, but they referred to the offspring. Unfortunately, I hate to use this term, but what they call the mulatto bastards. And they are referring to them, and we knew that meant there was interracial sex, interracial white fathers, and these women were being subjected to physical abuse lashes on the whip and everything else for having children. One of them had 3 children and she just wouldn't stop. So she was subjected to lashes. Then we get to the 19th century. We have Felix Quander, who lived, or Felix Jr. lived to the 20th century. But Felix, the father, was having trouble every step along the way in Fairfax County over property where he maintained it was his property, and the white man was saying it was his property, and citizens were coming forward trying to explain that this was really Felix's property. So they were trying to take it from him every step along the way. So this is what contributed to the strength of who we became, because the ancestors did not back down. And this is why we are so proud of them. And they left a legacy. Every time they lost the case, they left a legacy for us to find it in black and white. They stood up, they spoke up, they demanded their rights, even if they didn't get them. So we are in their debt because of their valor.
Great. Yeah, we're just got a lot of great questions coming in. I don't know if we even get to all of them.
I have time.
We do too. One question, and it relates to, I think, something that's really come to the fore in recent years, and that is the scale of the domestic slave trade here in Virginia. And the question is, do you know if any of your family members in the past, your ancestors, were sold or purchased in Alexandria on Duke Street, which is one of the famous so-called slave jails?
Well, Armfield slave market there on Duke Street. I've been there many times with the Urban League and also as a tour guide. That particular Armfield, they were the largest slave dealer in the United States, because what they had right there in Alexandria on Duke Street that was one of the 3 main ones. The others were New Orleans and in Natchez, Mississippi. We do not have any indication now in our oral history, not saying it never happened, of anybody with the Quander name or in the family being sold there. By the time George Washington enslaved that were of his ownership, if you want to call it that, they were free and they were not sold off. By the time they got to that in the 1828 period, the Quanders who were going to be freed were free. And we don't have any indication knowingly of those who were enslaved, predominantly on the Maryland side, that any of them had been sold off. But we do have a presence in the Catholic Church of the family working very hard for the Jesuits, and there is a possibility that some of them, maybe not having the Quander name, were indeed sold off, because the Jesuits did do that, not just from Georgetown, but from the lands that they had particularly in Southern Maryland, Charles and Prince George's counties.
Thank you. And my colleague, Ashley Ramey Craig, is working hard in the background. And I asked her to post Josh Rothman's new book called The Ledger and the Chain, which documents the slave jail that Judge Quander was mentioning. It's a really, really excellent book.
Franklin Armfield. I forgot the
Franklin Armfield. That's right. And they did become one of the largest slave traders in the American South. Let's see. Let me see. I think I might have a few others. We have some really specific ones, which are fine. Now we have. This gentleman says that we have a former neighbor, Welton Quander, in Alexandria, who was part of the second wave of landing at Normandy Beach with his all-black platoon. He wonders if you know about this gentleman.
Well, Welton Quander, he's gone to glory, and he was very much involved. He was a deacon at Alpha Street Baptist Church for many, many years. And his widow, we have another Nellie Quander, not the one from Alpha Kappa Alpha, but this other one, his widow was a member of another sorority, Delta Sigma Theta. She just passed away about 3 or 4 years ago. She was in her 90s, and Welton and Nellie were very, very active. Welton was very active in a number of the veterans organizations, and Nellie was an outstanding educator in Fairfax County and in the country. And she was a former national president of the Association of Elementary School Principals. And she was also the Grand Marshal of the Scottish Rite Christmas parade some years ago, which some of you may remember her parading down the Christmas cycle they have every year in Old Town Alexandria. That was Weldon's widow. Yes. And his son and daughter live here in the area. I know them. In fact, he is the brother of Gladys Quander Tansel that you saw, who was the first interpreter guide in Mount Vernon.
We have somebody on who said that Nellie B. Quander was my elementary school principal.
Excellent.
Yeah, lots of great family connections.
And not only that, she is the sister of the General Quander, who is the father, and she's the aunt of the other two Generals Quander.
Wow.
That's right.
Lots of great connections.
Yeah.
Oh, and one of my colleagues also posted that Josh Rothman's book that I mentioned earlier, we did record that talk. So if you're interested in that topic, there's a link in the chat where you can go and hear his talk about Franklin and Armfield. Let's see. Well, I think we're winding up. Go ahead and send me some more questions if you have some more. We got a great crowd out tonight.
I appreciate their coming out.
Yes.
I really like to be able to talk to people, and because of the COVID situation, it has not been possible. So there have been a number of virtuals like we're doing right now, but there really is nothing like being able to go face to face and be able to to autograph the book and give it to the person and put it in their hand. So this has to be the substitute. It's not an adequate substitute, but it's all we have. So let's make the best of it.
Yeah, it is a really strange situation we've been in, and on the one hand, we've been virtual of almost all of our programs, and the good news is we have a crowd that we probably wouldn't draw this many people at a live talk. So there is an upside. So we have another question. Did George Washington buy his enslaved people straight off the boat from Africa? I'm not sure that's necessarily in the scope of your work, but you may know.
And the answer is no. At the time, there was no direct slave trade coming to Maryland and Virginia. You had to go down to the islands. Barbados was the number one in the early part, and then it expanded to Jamaica and other places. What would happen in the beginning is that the ships would come to the islands, and then those here in Maryland and Virginia would take their boats and go down to the markets and purchase them and come here. What happened later, as the lucrativeness of it was more appreciated, then they started coming in, like into Annapolis, where Kunta Kinte and was found. George Washington inherited most of his enslaved when he was like 11 years old. I forget how many he got, but he did get quite a few when his brother, I think it was John Augustine, when his brother passed away. It might have been Lawrence. I'm not looking at my notes. He inherited, and then when he came to Mount Vernon in he was moving in 1758 and 59. There were several there that were already there that he inherited, and then he was obtaining them from the Maryland side of the river, where they were cheaper, and but he did not, as far as I know, actually purchase any off the boat down in the Caribbean area. He went to the market where he got existing ones that were already here, as far as I know.
We also have a question. A person wonders whether you could say a little bit about the relationship between the Quander and Syphax families.
Okay, well, the Quander and Syphax families were at Mount Vernon at the same time. The Quander family that was there, as I told you, there is a question. I'm not saying an absolute. There's a question about being descended from Bushrod Washington. It was George Washington's nephew, which would be the blood connection if there is one between George Washington and the Quanders. I had to be careful about saying that because I cannot make a declaration to that effect. The Syphaxes, on the other hand, were Martha Washington's enslaved. They are descended from George Washington Parke Custis, who was Martha Washington's grandson, called Jockey. And George Washington Parke Custis is the one who built the Arlington House which is where we have Arlington National Cemetery. And George Washington Parke Custis' daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee, married Robert E. Lee. When the Quanders, who did get their freedom after George Washington died and Martha let everybody go, they got their freedom. But for the Syphaxes who were still enslaved, some of them were free. But for those who got free, they went back to the Custis family, and their children and grandchildren, some of them ended up enslaved still at Arlington House under Robert E. Lee and his wife, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee. So that is the connection. Now, whether there are children born of unions between Quanders and Syphaxes, we don't know because it had not been said. They formed a league. We are the descendants of the enslaved in Mount Vernon, the League of the Descendants of Enslaved in Mount Vernon. And the Syphaxes are in there with us, the Quanders, Carolyn Branham's family, the Chins, several others, the Hollands, and at the risk of leaving people out, there are several others. And we have formed this league because we want to honor our ancestors, and we're working with Mount Vernon because they too want to recognize those who were the enslaved, whose contributions made it possible for George Washington to go off and become the father of our nation, because they got the crops in, the crops out, they distilled, they fished, they did everything to keep Mount Vernon going and relieve George Washington of some of those daily obligations.
Great. Another question, someone who's just joined, and I think the answer is probably pretty clear. They asked if you'd gotten a genealogist locally to do some of the research, but you are the genealogist.
Yeah, that's correct. I am.
And I know you probably did some research at our institution as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think those are most of the questions that we have. Absolutely feel free. We've got a few minutes left. If you have a few other questions that you want to put into the chat or in the question and answer. I have one question I wanted to ask you, Judge Quander, and that is, one of the things I really like about your book, a lot of things I like about it, but one of the things I like is, all of our families have people who are high achievers, like your four generals, and then you have people, that who don't, are just have a very difficult time. And of course, it doesn't help that they were being oppressed during pretty much all of this history. But you include the good, the bad, and the ugly in your book, and I think that's really important to recognize.
Absolutely. We've had our share of, quote, bad, but we look at out of that, we look out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope, which is a theme, of course, of Dr. Martin Luther King Memorial. And we had those that, in retrospect, we look at them a little bit askance now and say, well, that guy was a bit difficult, or perhaps he could be said that he was a troublemaker. And of course, unfortunately, that only gave rise to those who wanted to castigate him as such. If he didn't give them the gun, he certainly gave them the ammunition. But we also look and see how we can turn that into something of benefit. Because as I tell people and talk, well, this is how you don't do it. This is how you don't act. This is what you should not do. And everything that has happened, we try to look for the good to see how we can get something beneficial out of it. I have been a person who's always believed that we can say, and still I rise, because we have to keep upward bound. And when people say, but nobody in my family ever did anything, I say, wait a minute, let's slow down. Let's not say nobody did anything. You may not have been the first of this or the greatest of that, and maybe they didn't have educational opportunities, but keep in mind that you are here because they passed this way. Hopefully, there is some inspiration that you can get because of what grandma did, or grandfather, or uncle did, where they worked every day, they kept the faith, so to speak, they kept the family together. In spite of any challenges that they may have had, they were very specific in trying to be good, meaningful, upstanding. Look for that good. And if you're looking for heroes, don't necessarily make your hero a movie star or a sports figure. Bring your heroes home look inside your own families, because there are people, and you may not know who they are or the details of them, but there are people who have done just going to work every day. And that is certainly something to be proud of. You may not be able to do what we've done, but you may be, depending upon the circumstance, you may be able to do more. There may be some area that you can dig into that as yet unknown to you, that is there yet to be discovered, if only you ask and then follow through with a little kernel of what may turn up.
Absolutely. We have someone who has asked a question. Do you know if any of your family members have any connection with Jacob T. Hughes from World War II vet from Alexandria?
I do not know that name.
Okay, okay,
That's not a good answer, but Jacob T. Hughes, I'm not sure. I don't know who that is.
okay. And then we have someone who's asked, do you have any knowledge of enslaved Quanders successfully running away or escaping from Mount Vernon?
We do not have any record of Quanders successfully running away from Mount Vernon. At this stage, well, first of all, there were not that many. We had Nancy and her sister Rose and I believe her brother Joseph and their mother Suki Bay. They were all there. Their father was at another plantation. Of course, people were not ceremonially married necessarily. So, but he was at another plantation. We don't have any record of him running away. But there were a number of others who were there with them. Ona Judge, for one, she ran away. Hercules, who was George Washington's favorite chef, he ran away. I would not doubt that there were some who took leave and at least did have some recalcitrance, but we don't have any knowledge of runaways. But if I found some or one, I wouldn't be surprised.
And we have one that asks, where in Fairfax County was your relative Felix's property?
Well, Felix's property was down in the Accotink area. I'm not exactly sure where it was, but he was down in the Accotink area, and he had a farm down there, and he had some animals, and one of those animals is more than one case. One of the animals got out and ended up on somebody else's property, and they were claiming it. And Felix said, "You can't claim this property. It's mine. It's got my brand on it." And it became a very involved issue, involved people picking up sticks and hitting each other with it. The same thing with chickens that were wandering. Felix went and picked up what he claimed were his chickens. And they said, "No, those are our chickens. You came on here and took them." So, but Felix was down in Accotink. And then as time went on, in 1870s and 80s, there were a lot of violence. They shot up Felix's house to the point where it almost fell down to the ground. And it's unfortunate that although one son was shot in the head, apparently he recovered because he couldn't find any record, looked everywhere, of him actually dying. But the house was basically destroyed by gunfire on Easter Sunday morning, back around, and I'll say around, maybe not exactly, 1879. And that is well documented. There were like 15 newspaper articles that covered that. And basically I had an exhibit called Negro Thief or Honorable Man. It's a story of Felix Quander. And he was a direct descendant, of course, from Mount Vernon. The people say that this came from such a good family to come down to such a bad status now. Of course, they were deriding him racially in every way that they could.
And of course, those are all situations where you have to really think about the sources.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
And you've got the white newspapers making pronouncements, and it's very difficult to know sometimes whether that's really what the community thinks.
Yes.
Well, I think I've got one more here. Let's see. This is asking whether you have any knowledge of movement of the Quanders back and forth between Maryland and Virginia across the Potomac River.
Well, of course, at this current time, we're years removed from the original enslavement period. So we have a number of family members who are originally from the Maryland component who have migrated to or live in Virginia and reverse. And then, of course, we have those here in Washington, D.C. I was born here in Washington, D.C., but we are all related. There are 4 main branches, but originally, apparently, it all came from Maryland in the 1660s. But all of the Quanders are not from Mount Vernon. You need to know that. The ones who were on the Maryland side are not from Mount Vernon originally, but those who migrated over to the Virginia side and ended up at Mount Vernon and descended from Nancy Carter, she was at Mount Vernon, married into a freed family of Quanders right there at Mount Vernon. That is how the Quander name was introduced there. And the Nancy Carter and her part, West Ford, Hannah Bruce Ford, Quander, all of that part, the Ford part, that is the part that is related allegedly to Bushrod Washington. When you're doing a short soundbite, the news will say the Quanders are related to George Washington or Bushrod Washington, allegedly, but it's not all of us. It is that line that came out of Mount Vernon. And 2 of those, when I say there are 2 lines, actually there are 3 in Virginia and 2 in Washington. 2 of those lines, Washington, Maryland, 2 of those lines out of Mount Vernon are from West Ford. 2 of them are.
Just a general question, which is a good one. Someone had asked whether we will send an email to the participants afterwards with the links that we've been posting in the chat, and we absolutely can do that. Be happy to do that. That's one of the great things with these conversations and having these great colleagues of mine behind the scenes is posting a lot of things that connect to the conversation as it's going along.
Yes, and I tell people they could reach me at www.quanderquality.com. I emphasize use the www because if you just go in looking for Quanders, there's a lot of information and you'll be wandering looking for the website. And you can also do info@quanderquality.com, and that will bring you to me. It'll bring you to the website. You can find out more about the books, about the Quander family, etc.
Well, I think that's all the questions that I have gleaned, and I just can't thank you enough, Judge Quander. This has been fantastic, and thank our audience too. You've been really lively on the chat and very engaged, and we've got just so many messages just thanking you for this great presentation. So
I thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks. We're at Library of Virginia is always happy to host these. Also, let us know if there's books that you see that you'd like us to be talking about, because we love to get input from our audiences about our programming. So without further ado, thanks again, Judge Quander, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.